Now, I don't listen to these recordings. Are they coming out okay? Can you actually hear on them? I don't know.
Yeah.
You can? أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله مفيض الكلم والحكم وصلى الله على الاسم الأعظم سيدي ولد آدم وآله المصطفين على العرب والعجم. Our topic today is Aristotle, master of those who know, the first teacher, al-muallim al-awwal. Such are the titles and appellations by which he is known to posterity. We have two fundamental aims today, inshallah. The first will be an attempt to present Aristotle's classification of knowledge and the place of metaphysics therein. That is the first aim. Aristotle's classification of knowledge and where metaphysics fits in to that classification. Our second goal today, inshallah, will be to introduce Aristotle's teaching regarding substance. The doctrine of substance or thinghood as an object, or as the object, of study in metaphysics. This is easier said than done. We shall do our best. So Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in a place called Stagira or Stagira or Stagaira. I honestly don't know how it's pronounced. And I really don't even know where it is. Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever looked it up, which is bad for me because usually I look these things up. But since this, usually, that's really in Islamic studies. When there's some obscure town, I usually go and trace it and try to find. Perhaps I should do this, but anyhow. So he lived from 384 BCE to 322 BCE. He had a very interesting life also, if you read about it. W.D. Ross, in his famous book, which is simply entitled Aristotle, spends a lot of time on his life. That's probably the portion of Ross's book which would need serious revision today. I mean, the rest of it is just an attempt to present Aristotle as Aristotle presents himself in English, but in English and in a sort of systematic way. Because I've told you that the writings of Aristotle are difficult to read. There are new studies. If you're really interested in the history of Aristotle as a person and his school, there is a book. A very new book on the subject. It was written in Italian, has been translated into English. It's just called Aristotle and His School. Anyhow, we will not dwell on the history of Aristotle or his school. What concerns us really is his philosophy. So let us, without further ado, turn to that. Now, it can, without any doubt, it can easily be said that in the annals of learning, Aristotle is without peer. And in fact, his figure continues to tower over human wisdom. Not only did Aristotle write in every field of human inquiry, but nearly all that he wrote remains relevant, even if it has been neglected by many people today. Had Aristotle only written on logic, this alone would have been sufficient to etch his name on the edifice of human knowledge for as long as man endures. Thus, Aristotle is rightly known as master of those who know. Among the Muslims, Aristotle is called the first teacher, al-muallim al-awwal. Now there's a first, there has to be a second, inevitably. So Aristotle has been given this honor. In Muslim texts, he's often referred to as al-muallim al-awwal. In Western texts, in addition to master of those who know, he's simply referred to as the philosopher. So with a definite article, he is al-filasuf, the philosopher. Yes. So it's just like in Arabic, when people say al-kitab, they really mean the work of Sibawayh in grammar. I mean, obviously in other contexts it means the Quran, but other than that, when people say al-kitab, it is the work of Sibawayh in grammar. So similarly, when you put the definite article of philosopher, it's Aristotle. Other philosophers then who in the history of Islam were seen to have achieved an extraordinary level of erudition and who had also produced writings of encyclopedic scope, they also are honored with the title Al-Muallim al-Thani, for example. And Al-Muallim al-Thani, the second teacher, is Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi died in 399 of the Hijrah, corresponding to 950 of the Christian calendar. As for Al-Muallim al-Thalith, this is, generally speaking, Ibn Sina, died 437, corresponding to 1037. Now, in addition to Ibn Sina, sometimes a philosopher who came much, much later, who was also a man of encyclopedic learning, is Mir Damad. I mentioned these names in the first lecture. Mir Damad was from the school of, he's associated with the school of Isfahan. He died in 1041 of the Hijri, or 1631. And in my introduction to a work I told you about in the first lecture of the school of Mullah Sadra, which was found in India, I have conferred the title of Al-Muallim al-Rabi' in my introduction. The fourth teacher. There's a certain amount of hyperbole, obviously, on this man, Sayyid Murtada Nahrawi Ghazipuri, who wrote an extremely important work on the divine names, which is a kind of extended elaboration of the doctrines of Al-Hikmat al-Muta'ali, or Mullah Sadra's school. All right, so these are some of these titles. Aristotle then personified to the nth degree his own famous words with which he opens his book, which became known as the Metaphysics. All men by nature desire to know. So this is the translation of W.D. Ross. It's Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 1. It's also referred to as Metaphysics Book Alpha. A more modern translation by Joe Sachs renders, probably more literally, I don't know, I am not a scholar of Greek, as follows: all human beings by nature stretch themselves out toward knowing. So Aristotle devoted himself assiduously to acquiring knowledge in every field. And there were writings of his which do not survive. As you know, he was a disciple of Plato. And Plato's writings take the dialogic form. They uses the form of the dialogue. Apparently, Aristotle also wrote dialogues, but they haven't survived. Also, in terms of further reading, if you should pursue this in the future, pursue these inquiries, there are a large number of works that have the title The Cambridge Companion to, and it'll say Aristotle, Plato, what have you, Descartes, Kierkegaard, all these. And, they're of varying quality. It depends, really. But the one on Aristotle is really good. and it makes for fascinating reading. Also, there's a lot of more information there about his life. So the Cambridge Companion to Aristotle is an excellent book, and there are essays on every aspect of his philosophy in addition to a comprehensive biography. And it's very interesting to read because we have other interesting texts that survive of Aristotle. For example, a copy or some kind of quotation, really, from his will, his last will and testament survives, and you get some idea of what the man was like. And it seems that he did live up to the high standards that he set out in his work, the Nicomachean Ethics, or at least that's what the opinion of the person who wrote that particular chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Aristotle says. So Aristotle wrote on really every sort of aspect of human learning. That makes him a very, very encyclopedic figure. We find that very hard to believe today. We find that to be something impossible almost. And today it's almost impossible for you just to master, let's say, chemistry, to master just one single subject. And within chemistry, there's organic chemistry, analytical chemistry, physical chemistry. There's different kinds, and in the same fashion, you would have various subfields in other fields, subspecialties in other fields. So when we hear something like that, we find that very hard to imagine. However, if you look in the Islamic intellectual tradition, you find encyclopedic figures who did have a learning, not at the level of Aristotle. I don't think you can be at the level of Aristotle because it's a hard act to follow, isn't he? I mean, what can you do better than inventing logic? Probably the only person who sort of gets close to Aristotle in terms of making an earth-shattering contribution to logic is the Austrian mathematical logician Kurt Gödel. That guy got close with his incompleteness theorems and many other things that he did. So he would be the only serious contender I could think of. Excuse me. But in the Islamic tradition, there were people who had achieved an encyclopedic range of learning. Ibn Sina is an obvious example, and the writings are there to prove it. Not only does he have Kitab al-Shifa, he has Kitab al-Qanun fi al-Tib. So Kitab al-Shifa is a comprehensive encyclopedic work on the full range of philosophy. And he also has a massive book, al-Qanun fi al-Tib, the Canon of Medicine, which was a textbook for at least 6 centuries, even into Europe, and in traditional Islamic medicine, people still refer to this work. You have people like Nasiruddin al-Tusi, the commentator on Ibn Sina, who was a master of mathematics. He has works on geometry. In fact, Nasiruddin al-Tusi is probably the first person in history to really produce a full-fledged textbook on trigonometry. I would say he's the first. There was an earlier work by Al-Biruni on trigonometry, but it was kind of lost and rediscovered in modern times. But the work of al-Tusi was known. A lot of people don't know that in trigonometry you have the 6 trigonometric functions, and the Muslims came up with a good deal there. So there was a tremendous sort of range. Tusi also wrote on astrology, astronomy. He wrote various works on theology. He commented on Ibn Sina. You have again this person Mir Damad. You have Bahauddin al-Amiri. You have Mullah Sadra. You have people like although he was strangely opposed to logic, but you have Jalaluddin Suyuti, also someone of encyclopedic learning. You have Taftazani. There are many figures. Now, why did I dwell on this point? Because in modern times, the notion of knowledge itself is in danger. And there is a very little understanding of the interrelationships and connections between knowledge. Excuse me one moment. Saad, you remember that person that I emailed you about? Did that person add the course? Because I don't see them, and I'm wondering what happened.
Last time I checked, no, they didn't.
Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to find out. So, this notion of the interrelationship and integrated character of knowledge and systematic learning is something that is very, very lost in our times. And in the university, they talk about interdisciplinary studies and so forth. But it is an unfortunate fact that most people today, if they have a PhD in some field or subject, they know little or nothing of anything outside that field. Moreover, also in modern times, particularly in these United States, there is a tremendous degree of anti-intellectualism and disdain of learning nowadays. So I would say that in this age that we find ourselves, knowledge itself is endangered. And if knowledge is endangered, truth is endangered. And in that sense, we live in the age of lies and deceptions. And the entire overall zeitgeist or spirit of the times is an infernal and a demonic one, in which truth is almost it really is rejected, and it is the lie which is proclaimed constantly. And so all around us we are surrounded by a kind of counterfeit culture, and the whole media machine with advertising and so-called popular culture, a very bizarre turn of phrase, popular culture, but film, TV, internet, the whole organism is designed to keep people in a state of ignorance. All right, having made those remarks, which I think are very important, let us turn then to Aristotle's classification of knowledge. So for Aristotle, human knowledge is a unified body. It is an integrated whole, and therefore it has a clear structure. Systematic inquiry leads, according to Aristotle, to a threefold division of human knowledge, of learning, of the sciences. So when I use the word science or sciences, when I use that in this lecture, in this discussion, I don't mean physics and chemistry. I don't have in mind natural sciences. I have in mind the Arabic word ilm in a formal sense, and its plural sciences would correspond to ulum, right? So the ulum, the actual systematic human knowledge, or if you like, the sciences, they have a threefold division according to Aristotle. Because for Aristotle, man, the human being, has three dimensions or aspects. First of all, we have man the maker, man the doer, and man the knower. This is, in fact, how the 20th century philosopher Mortimer Adler tried to present the philosophy of Aristotle in the most simple language in his very well-known book, Aristotle for Everybody. But he didn't make that up. It's in Aristotle. Aristotle regards man as having three dimensions or aspects. So if we speak of man the maker, or man as a maker, what he means is that man is a producer of all sorts of artifacts. Secondly, the second dimension or aspect is man, the human being, as a moral and social creature, a moral and social being. One might speak of, as we said, man, the doer, inasmuch as a human being can do right or wrong. And finally, we have man, the knower. Man seeks to acquire knowledge. He seeks to learn all sorts of things. So on this basis, there is a kind of threefold division of knowledge, of sciences. And man as a knower would come under what Aristotle would have regarded as theoretical sciences. Man, the doer, under practical sciences. And then man, the maker, under productive sciences. In the Islamic context, in Islamic philosophy, we speak of al-ilm or al-hikmah, wisdom, or of al-falsafa. And then there's al-falsafatu al-nadariya, or al-ilm al-nadari and al-ilm al-amali. That is to say, again, theoretical and practical, or al-hikmatu al-nadariya wal-hikmatu al-amaliya. Practical wisdom, theoretical wisdom. And then typically productive wisdom or productive science is usually not, it's kind of a funny thing because the way it worked out in Islamic philosophy is they typically these things would be called crafts. But the word in Arabic is sina'a. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a wood carver or something like this. When we think of arts and crafts today, we think of the sorts of things that you would pick up at an art and craft shop like Hobby Lobby or Michael's or something like this in America, these famous shops that sell you things for supplies for painting and drawing and whatnot. But there are things which are craft, and it's not strictly speaking a science. Just for example, in a very modern, there's a very famous book. It's a very nice book. It's called The Historian's Craft. And so history is not really a science; it's a craft, according to this guy. There are some people also, for example, in later Usul al-Fiqh, for example, very late in the history of Usul al-Fiqh, there's a famous book called Kifayat al-Usul, it's Shi Usul al-Fiqh by Akhund Khurasani. And he doesn't really give a definition of Usul al-Fiqh, because if you're going to define something by that time in the Islamic tradition, if it's an ilm, it's got to have a definition. And if it's an ilm, it has a definition, then it has to correspond to what are called these 8 things called the Ru'us al-Thamaniya. And according to him, really couldn't do that in Usul al-Fiqh, because Usul al-Fiqh has so many things, so he doesn't really give a definition. So for him, Usul al-Fiqh is a kind of a craft, it's a sina'a. Without putting too fine a point on it, though, we can say we've got theoretical, practical, and productive sciences or crafts, if you like, or knowledges. And that would even include things like, for Aristotle anyway, things like rhetoric. This is brought out nicely in the reading which I gave you. I think that he makes a point of mentioning that. Anyhow, so you have these kind of 3 broad divisions. And then in the Islamic tradition also, people like Avicenna, they have a division where they say in the theoretical sciences, then you would have metaphysics, you would have mathematics, you would have today maybe what we would call natural science. But really, they would have called metaphysics ma ba'd al-tabi'a or ma wara' al-tabi'a, and it was regarded as first philosophy, al-falsafatu al-ula. And then what they would call al-tabi'a, or the study of nature, is physics. And that would be second philosophy. But if we wanted to say this in a more modern context, we would say, all right, well, we've got metaphysics, we've got mathematics, and we have natural science, and under natural science we would have physics, chemistry, biology, what we conventionally now call the natural sciences. And that's the way that this guide to Aristotle by Vella sets it out. He has a chart somewhere in there where he diagrams things this way. But it's interesting that mathematics also is under the theoretical sciences, and there you have arithmetic and geometry. Arithmetic focusing on discrete quantity, geometry on continuous quantity. And because this is a modern book, I think he doesn't mention 2 other things that traditionally came under mathematics. And that was, I think I mentioned this even last time, is the study of music theory, because that's really the study of quantity in time, quantity as it plays out in time. And then you would have astronomy, astrology, and the ancients did not really distinguish between the 2. And there you have quantity studied both in time and in space, because you calculate these positions according to the Ptolemaic system of where these heavenly bodies are as seen by an observer on the earth. So you assume that they go around the earth. I know that they don't. It's a fine mathematical model. And that's how So anyway, all that came under mathematics. In the practical sciences, you would have ethics. And so al-hikmatul amaliyya includes ethics, akhlaq, ilm al-akhlaq, and that also then applies to how you conduct yourself in your family. And that was typically called home economics, or in Arabic, tadbirul manzil. So when you hear that in Arabic, it sounds like, well, how do you arrange your furniture in your house or something? That's not what it means. It's how you run your family, your household, so to speak. And similarly, then there was tadbirul mudun, the running or governing or organizing of a city. How does ethics, akhlaq, play out in the polis, in the polity? So tadbirul mudun was typically rendered in English as political economy. Nowadays they call it political science. It's very different from what people like Plato and Aristotle had in mind. They wrote, when Aristotle wrote his Politics, when Plato had his Republic, it's a very, very different view of things. Tadbirul mudun. Mudun is the plural of Medina. Yeah. There's a very famous book also, which bears important similarities with the famous book by Aristotle. With the famous book by Plato called The Republic. I really don't know why they translate it as The Republic. The word in Greek is politia, so it should be called the polity. People who've never read the book think somehow it's this great document which is the basis of our beautiful republic, and it's not at all. Go and read The Republic. It shows you have not read the work. Anyhow, so there's a work very much modeled, which not modeled, but which should be read together with the so-called Republic of Plato, and it's by Al-Farabi. It's called, usually it's just known by its short title, Al-Madinatul Fadila, the ideal city, or the virtuous city. But its full name, I think in Arabic, is Ara'u Ahlil Madinatil Fadila, the views of the people of the virtuous city. And I think there's an English translation of that. And, in Christian thought, there's a famous person, Augustine or Augustine. I've heard it pronounced both ways, I don't know. And it's called the City of God. So this whole idea of what really is the ideal way for human beings to organize themselves as a polity is an interesting one, and has gone throughout history. And in that sense, this work, The Republic, along with the Politics of Aristotle, these are among the most important works in the history of Western civilization, for sure. And obviously they had a resonance and influence in Islamic philosophy when you come across things like this by Al-Farabi. Anyhow, so this is a kind of scheme for the division of knowledge and learning, and there's that chart in Vela's book that makes it in the form of a kind of a modern diagram. It's figure 1 on page 13. But there's more to the divisions of all learning by Aristotle than just this. So just as man is conceived in a threefold fashion by Aristotle, there's also 3 types of entity which are investigated in theoretical science. So remember, we've got science or knowledge, we have theoretical, practical, and productive. And I forgot one thing. There's also, where does the soul fit in? Or psychology. But we will come to that. Let's leave that for now. I will introduce it elsewhere. So we have, under theoretical science, under al-hikmatul nadhariyya, we have 3 types of chief entity which are examined. The first of these are entities which are separable and unchangeable. Maybe we should start writing on the whiteboard. I don't know, but or is it? Huh? And then we'll be very far away from the recording. But yeah. So we have. Thank you. 3 types of entity. So we have 3. Let's put these here, and then we can have some sense of where the lecture is going. So we have what are called entities. Entities which are separable and changeable. All right? It's the first kind. The second are, let's see, in this order, entities which are unseparable and unchangeable. Unchangeable. Sorry, I'm having trouble writing at this angle. And then we have entities which are separable and changeable. Okay? Just to keep you oriented.
The first one and the last one's the same. Separable and unchangeable.
Separable and unchangeable. Yeah, I should, sorry, I made a mistake. The first one is separable and unchangeable. Okay? The first, let's make sure we have this right. So the first is separable and unchangeable. Okay? Separable and unchangeable. Then the second is on both of them. Unseparable, unchangeable. And then, excuse me, the last is separable and changeable. Okay, so now let's go over these. Let's go over these now. See what Aristotle meant by them. It's very important for you to get this, to understand where he is going. Otherwise, you won't understand how we get metaphysics, or the way Aristotle looks at metaphysics. And the way he looked at metaphysics is different from how, excuse me, Ibn Sina approached things and how people came after. There are very important differences. But you really have to know what Aristotle said, otherwise you won't understand. Or maybe you will, but it's better if you have an idea where it's coming from, because this is really what set it all off. This work, The Metaphysics of Aristotle, is a notoriously difficult book. There were Arabic translations of it, and Ibn Sina has a very famous autobiography translated in English. Are any of you aware of that? And he has an autobiography. It's pretty short. He dictated it to one of his disciples, and you can read what he said. It was fascinating reading. And the relevant point for us is that he says there that he had this book, The Metaphysics of Aristotle, and he read it 40 times and did not understand it. And that one day he came across an explanation, a commentary on this work of Aristotle by Al-Farabi, and then things opened for him. It's really unfortunate that so many of the works of Al-Farabi are lost. There's many of his works which just simply didn't survive. And there's a predecessor to Al-Farabi who's very, very important also, named Al-Kindi. Almost everything of Al-Kindi is lost. And there's even important works of Ibn Sina that are either lost or he never completed, or it's hard to say. But at least in the case of Ibn Sina, we are in a much better position. So it's important to understand where these things are coming from. So
Al-Kindi is also another encyclopedic figure, right?
he's another encyclopedic and very early figure.
In the 800 something.
He's very early. It's interesting because we often know the titles of books, even though we don't have them. There was I'm just throwing these things out because many of you are very new to the whole area of Islamic studies, and you should understand how wide it is. There is a very famous catalog of books called Al-Fihrist with a ta maftuha, an open ta, Al-Fihrist, by someone named Ibn Nadim, and that's actually translated into English. I don't know if it's still in print by who translated that? It was Dodge. I think Baynard Dodge. Anyhow, it's in 2 volumes. Then he actually called it The Fihrist of Ibn Nadim. Ibn Nadim was a warraq. He was a paper maker, bookbinder type thing. Some people say he was a bookseller. I mean, I don't know. I haven't investigated his biography, but I have Al-Fihrist. And whether he was a bookbinder or a bookseller or what have you, any kind of book which would come his way for binding or selling or what have you, he would note it down, and he would write some notes about the author and so forth, and then he organized his book by topic, and so we have the names of lots of works which don't survive, because this is way before the Mongol invasion, you see, and then after the Mongol invasion and the sacking of Baghdad, lots of things were lost and so on and so forth. So we know there's a huge list of books by, let's say, Al-Kindi, and you find a lot of weird stuff in that if you read that book. It's a fascinating book. We find out about different styles of calligraphy also. Nobody really knows what they are. Supposedly the people of Mecca wrote the Quran a certain way, and it was called Al-Makki, and some people of Medina wrote it a certain way, it's called Al-Madani, but we really don't know what that is. And that's where they invented the term Hijazi script, which is just a modern invention, referring to Mecca and Medina. Anyway, so these are just little side notes to our subject. So these 3 types of entity, let's look at the first entity. These are entities which are separable and unchangeable. Now, what does Aristotle mean by this? By separable, he means that these are things that do not depend on anything else for their existence. So what's an example? He gives the example of, you could take any object. Let's say you had a rubber ball, for example. I mean, just come up with any simple example. And let's say it's a blue rubber ball. Well, the ball itself is separable and unchangeable. It exists on its own, as it were. And we're not talking the ultimate sense that God has sustained its existence or something. It exists by itself. We need not, in other words, invoke something else, some other entity, to explain the existence of this rubber ball. But the fact that it is a blue rubber ball, if we focus on the color of the ball, the color is not self-subsistent and separable. We have the color, we have blueness, which is actualized in the color blue in the ball. But blueness all by itself, we don't have. We have to invoke this other thing, in this case, the rubber ball. You could have a blue jacket also, couldn't you? You have a blue shirt. Someone here is wearing a blue shirt, right? So that color, for example, is not a self-subsistent and separable thing, whereas the ball is. So it turns out that this first division, where we have entities that are separable and unchangeable, these are the proper subject matter of al-falsafat al-ula, or first philosophy or metaphysics. And so that which is separable and unchangeable is what Aristotle really calls substance. And actually he calls primary substance. Primary substance. So if we move to the second group or batch of things, these are entities which excuse me, are unseparable and unchangeable. excuse me. What do we have here? Here he gives the example of the objects which are studied in mathematics. In other words, number and figure. Number is discrete quantity, and figure is continuous quantity. And of course, that's arithmetic and geometry, and we already spoke about ancient mathematics and how it includes, music, astrology, etc. Excuse me. So entities which are unseparable and unchangeable are number and figure. Are you all following me? You following what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
You've read this, I hope.
I read.
You did, okay. So I'm more or less following. I mean, there's other things I'm putting in, but I'm more or less following the book. This is on page 14. So, for example, he says, the author of this work, Vela, says that numbers and figures exist in a way similar to attributes like color. That is to say, as qualifications and quantifications of substance.
Also, color is also inseparable and unchangeable, right? As a quality.
Yes. It's not self-subsistent, and it's not self-subsistent and not separable. It has to be actualized or realized in some other thing. Yeah. So numbers and figures do not exist as substances. They're the second kind of entity, but numbers and figures are nevertheless real, and we can attain to some kind of a systematic, if you like, we can say scientific knowledge of the nature of numbers, their properties, the nature of figure and their properties, and that's the business of arithmetic and geometry. And it's very easy to see that this knowledge is what? This knowledge is theoretical. It's a theoretical knowledge. It's not a practical knowledge. Solving a problem, making a proof in geometry, or performing an arithmetic calculation doesn't tell us how to act. So it's not practical in that sense. When we talk about practical wisdom, it has to do with what we can call the ought, what we should do. So when we say practical wisdom, it directly has an ethical, moral component. Is man the doer? And whereas mathematics, it's a kind of a pure, very abstract inquiry. All right, so that's the second kind of entity studied in theoretical science. So the first entity studied in theoretical science, its proper subject is metaphysics. The second kind of entity, inseparable, unchangeable, is the study of quantity, whether continuous or discrete, and that is the area of mathematics. And then finally we have entities which are separable and changeable, the third one. Okay, so what do you think is going on here? Well, here we have these entities. They are separable, they are self-subsistent, they are subject to change, they are changeable. These are the proper subject matter of physics, or the study of nature. So we're not using the word physics in the modern sense here. And it comes from a Greek word meaning nature. Again, that's just what I'm conveying to. I'm not a scholar of Greek. So, natural science, physics, or physis in Greek, is second philosophy. Now notice that these third kind of entities are also substances. They are entities, they're self-subsistence, but they are subject to change. So first philosophy are metaphysics, and physics, which is second philosophy, are both sciences of substances. Metaphysics is more general. It studies substances in the most general possible way, while al-falsafatu thaniya, or second philosophy, physis or physics, studies substances in nature. So in physics, Aristotle is concerned with the first principles of nature, and in this context I will just point out a very important contribution also of Aristotle. And again, this contribution of Aristotle, like much of his work, is deemed irrelevant by modern philosophers today. But if you read traditional Islamic texts, they assume all of this. Now, I can understand that when we say, well, the Muslims were wrong, and Aristotle was wrong, and all the people of the past were wrong in saying that the heavenly bodies went around the sun. And yes, all right, fine, but but were they wrong in their metaphysical?
Heavenly bodies went around the earth.
Sorry, did I say that they went around the sun? That was an egregious error on my part. Although, to be very frank, I mean, if you actually look into the history of the subject, there are various things which don't make sense. They simply don't. And a lot of this is not known to people. There was a very famous scholar of the history of mathematics, specifically the history of astrology and ancient astronomy. Again, the ancients didn't distinguish between the two, and he was a German scholar named Otto Neugebauer. And Otto Neugebauer taught at Brown University. And, there were other really great scholars at this university who studied this subject. One of them was David Pingree. They're all deceased now. So Neugebauer was an indefatigable scholar. He learned ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, this and that. And he was only interested in studying the scientific and the mathematical, astronomical, astrological sciences in these civilizations. And he has a 3-volume work on Babylonian astronomical astrological tablets. So this is not your bedtime reading. And you're not going to find it at your local Barnes and Noble, and you won't find it on Amazon. It is very hard even to find used. So on one of my visits to England, I was sitting and reading because I wanted to read the passage for myself in the original in the library of the Warburg Institute. So he found out that, the Babylonians had these very detailed tablets on which they had tables of astronomical phenomenon, of when, the planet Jupiter would be in a particular position in the sky as observed by someone on the Earth. And they had algorithms for calculating this out, but nobody really knows where the algorithms come from. And not only that, there's something called the precession of the equinoxes. Are you aware of this? Do you know what that is? Yeah, so this is an important point. I'm making an important point here. The Earth is actually rotating on its axis, and the Earth is approximately a sphere. It's not a perfect sphere, and it's not a straight up and down vertical. The Earth is actually tilted at an angle of about 23 degrees. It's about maybe 22 and a half degrees. And as it rotates around that axis, it wobbles a bit. So the axis is wobbling. And the wobble is very slight. And as it wobbles, that axis, while it's wobbling, traces out a little circle. So this is called precessional motion. And in fact, there's another thing called nutation for it. So as it wobbles, it doesn't trace out a perfect circle. It's kind of a wavy line which comes out to a circle. Well, the ancients knew about this. And it's important because if you compile some sort of... The stars which are really far away, there are some stars which are called fixed stars. Right? They seem not to move. And the ancients referred to, the moving stars and the fixed stars. They called them in Arabic al-Kawakib al-Sayyara, the moving stars, and then al-Kawakib al-Thabita. And al-Kawakib al-Sayyara were the actual so-called planets. And in Greek also planet is planetes. It means the things that move, the wanderers. So that includes the sun, the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, all of these so-called planets which are visible. I know in modern astronomy the sun is not a planet, it's a star, etc. But these are things which are observed to move, and the others would seem to be fixed. But the so-called fixed stars are also moving due to the precession precession of the equinox, there is a slight change of about 1 degree every 72. Is it 1 degree or 1? Yeah, every 72. Every 72 years. So anyway, the point is the ancients knew about this. Well, how did they know about this? Because it's not relevant if you actually think that the world is flat. That shows that they didn't have some stupid notion that the world was flat. And it turns out that many of these algorithms really require a heliocentric notion. And there were ancient thinkers who spoke of a heliocentric system as well. And in fact, even Copernicus appeals to that when he writes his famous work, which sets off the so-called Copernican revolution. So what we know about the ancients is very, I think, subject to what we think about the ancients is very much not as things really were. So when we look at Aristotle, in his study of nature, he introduces an idea which I think is still very important and very relevant, and it has been thrown out of modern science. He introduces what are called the four causes. Now, that's not cause in the sense of cause and effect as we use that binary today, where you light a match, for example, and set some brush on fire. And that's the match is the cause of the fire, and the fire is the effect, and so forth. That sense is also there, but he's describing what we see in nature. So Aristotle explains these first principles of nature in physics, and he introduces this well-known theory of the four causes that the student of nature must understand. What are these four causes? There's what we have, which is the material cause. There's the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Final cause is very important. So modern science only is interested in efficient cause. So what do we mean? They often give the example of, well, let's say you want to build a bed or something like that. Well, the material cause is the wood, and the formal cause is the actual structure of the bed, having a particular base and legs and headboard and whatnot. And the efficient cause is let's say the carpenter who constructs it. And the final cause is what it's for. Well, a bed is made to lie down on and sleep and take rest. So this notion of directed end or goal, or what is called telos in Greek, or what is teleology, is what we are looking at when we talk about final cause. In the case, we introduced in our, this very simple example a few moments ago of a blue or red rubber ball, right? We said a blue rubber ball. So in the case of the blue rubber ball, the material cause is the actual stuff, the rubber, out of which this bouncing ball is made. The formal cause is the actual, in this case, spherical shape that it would take. The efficient cause is obviously the person who fashioned it or manufactured it, or the engineer who designed the processes in the factory that would bring it about, and there might be more than one. There might be a nexus of efficient causes. And then there's the final cause. What's it made for? Well, it's made for playing with, to provide pleasure. It's made so that it would bounce. This is what we would say. So in the study of physis, or nature, Aristotle introduces this. And this is very important because Aristotle defends the idea that there is a purpose and a design in the universe, and that everything is made or fashioned by the fashioner. And he has a proof for the existence of God. Very famous proof, the prime mover, also in the physis, the physics. So Aristotle strongly argues for and defends the idea that everything in the cosmos is directed at some end or goal. And mind you, it's a cosmos. In Greek, the opposite of cosmos, the contrary of cosmos, is chaos. It is a cosmos by the word. The word itself means that it's ordered. There's an order. There's a design. So now this comes up. This brings us to the idea of the soul, which I said I would bring us back to. Where does the study of the soul, or what is traditionally called psychology, and that's very different from modern psychology of Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernays and Carl Jung and all of these chaps. Psychology, literally the word means, the study of the soul. Because the word psychology is, in English we have the word psyche. Usually we don't say the P. It's a silent P. Psyche usually means, it refers to the meaning of, in the sense of soul in English. But the word in Greek, it's funny, usually when they transliterate Greek into English, they put a Y, and whereas the sound in Greek is more something like a U. So the word for soul in Greek is actually psyche. And it's quite interesting. If you go and you look this up in a Greek dictionary, as I did many, many, many years ago when I first heard this in Princeton, I went into the library, got the Greek English lexicon and flipped through it. And you'll find out that it also has this notion of to blow, which you'll find in Arabic, right? You have ruh, it's a blowing like a wind, and then even the other word in Arabic, which is nafs, is related to another word in Arabic which means breathing. And oddly enough, you have the same in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you also have ruh, although they have messed up the pronunciation of Hebrew, and they tend to pronounce it as ruach or ruach now. But anyway, it's ruh. And what is it for nafs in Hebrew? It's nefesh. Yeah. So I found that absolutely fascinating. So in the context of Aristotle, the single most important distinction in nature, in physis, in the study of physics, or the study of the natural world, is the distinction between that which is alive and that which is not, or that which lives and that which does not live. Moreover, Aristotle identifies the principle of life in all living things with what he calls the soul, or the psyche, the psyche. So psychology is the study of the soul. Now there is some difference of opinion, and Ibn Sina also has. So Aristotle has a book called De Anima. It's known by its Latin title, or Peri Psyche, or On the Soul. And I really think the most readable translation of that is by Joe Sachs. It's a very inexpensive book and has a very beautiful introductory essay. And it's actually not difficult when talking about Aristotle in terms of what he wrote. That's not a difficult book compared to the metaphysics. His most readable book is the Nicomachean Ethics. But anyway, yes, and that brings us to ethics. So once you've studied the soul, then how does one live? And so that's sort of the breakdown in Aristotle, and that's also the plan of this book. Very nice book, Aristotle Guide for the Perplexed. Now, there is a difference of opinion, though, especially among later people like Ibn Sina. He has his own On the Soul, Fin Nafs, Fi Ilm Nafs, about where this particular investigation of psychology, of the nature of the soul, whether it comes under physics, physis, the study of nature, or whether it comes under metaphysics, or does it sort of partake of both. So that's a kind of overview of this. I think we just stopped now. There were a lot of questions. I think there was a question over here. You had your hand up for a question or comment.
You mentioned the four causes. He did not, this book, the Guide to the Perplexed, didn't detail that out. I thought he referred to it in passing on page 15.
Yeah, he does, but he'll go into it more. That's why, you've got this book. You can read the rest of it yourself. That's more, because it's under the study of nature, under physis, it's in the nature or physis chapter, which is chapter 3. He'll go into it in more detail there.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I read the other book, the elementary book.
Aristotle for Everybody.
Yeah, there he goes into more detail.
He goes into more detail. It's amazing how he wrote such a simple...
That's very beautiful.
Isn't it?
And I think you should write something like that on Islamic philosophy for our youngsters and college students. Really, I mean, that is so fluid.
Well, I don't know if I could do something like that. That's as I said, that's what we call in Arabic as-sahl al-mumtana', the impossibly easy. He makes it look easy. It's not. It's very difficult to write a book like that.
Yeah, but that's what our youth needs, and not only youth, even adults need.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it very easy to read, understand. Once you have the grounding, I mean, this becomes very easy to.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that there's nothing that a Muslim would not really agree with in that. There might be some other things, in Western philosophy, but when it comes to Aristotle, it's very close to the fitra. Maybe, I don't know.
What else from an Aristotle, like, for example,
sorry? Yeah.
from the works of Mullah Sadra and
Yes,
Ibn Sina, those understanding we need to distill and simplify for youngsters because they are bombarded by the philosophy in their college, nothing to, no shield from our perspective. Right? So at least Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadra brings a little Islamic perspective into philosophy and adds that dimension, right?
Yeah, good, yeah. Difficult job. Maybe one of you can do that.
Okay.
Very difficult job to do something like that. Right, go ahead, Rehan.
So when you talk about the psyche, isn't the modern Muslim psychology in the notion of the mind?
Mm-hmm.
The mind is connected with the Enlightenment period and their rejection of kind of immaterial objects. Because there's a book called The Ghost Machine, and the whole
All right.
the
ghost machine. Or is it the ghost in the machine?
No, the whole thesis was the Enlightenment's rejection of the soul led to the creation of the mind, which is not purely material. But
Yeah, I haven't read this book. Who's the author of this?
It sounds like Julian James's breakdown of the bicameral mind when he talks about the same thing.
It was like George something.
Yeah, I haven't read these books, but the person who causes this problem, really, what you were alluding to, this breakdown, and then this notion comes in of the mind, and they have this whole thing called philosophy of mind, was it doesn't exist in traditional philosophy. In traditional philosophy, in Islamic philosophy, there's nothing called philosophy of mind, and in fact, there's nothing called epistemology.
Those are 2 classes I take next semester.
What?
Those are 2 classes I take next semester.
Allah fi anak inshallah. A'anak Allah inshallah. Yeah, that's tough. No, it's Descartes.
Right, yeah.
Descartes
Minded man.
brings in these problems. There's actually an interesting book if you're doing this. Now I recommend these books by this author with just a word of caution, because he's a Thomist, he adheres to the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and when he's doing that, he does a very good job. But anytime he talks about anything else, and that's rare in his books, but from time to time he feels the need to make little comments. He doesn't like Muslims at all. And he says some very funny things about politics. But to be fair, he says them in passing. His name is Edward Feser. Feser is Feser. He has a book on philosophy of mind. Yeah, and he does a very good job. I don't really think he says anything against Muslims there, but he has another book which is really very well written, except for these maybe 3 kind of dumb comments in the book about things which really were irrelevant to what he was talking about. But what's the title? He wrote a refutation of, I think it's called The Atheist Delusion. Because there's the famous book called The God Delusion by Mr. Dworkin. Is it Dworkin or Dawkins? Sorry, not Dworkin. I'm sorry. I was confusing that with another book. And he wrote this book on philosophy of mind, which deals with this whole business very well about because he doesn't agree with modern philosophy of mind, and he also wrote a nice introduction to Aquinas. And again, there's a lot in common between when you start reading these, you see where all the overlap is, and Aquinas was a serious student of Aristotle. And he also was aware of things by Ibn Sina. Things were translated in Latin, but anyway, so that's where it comes from. This whole thing comes from Aristotle, and they kind of come up with this thing called the mind. Well, what is the mind? And they're obsessed with the brain. And the ancients never talked about the brain. They knew about the brain, but when they talked about the sort of center of cognition and feeling in the human being, it was always what? Was it the brain? It was the heart. Ibn Arabi talks about the heart. Al-Ghazali talks about the heart. The Quran has many different words for heart. It's not just qalb and qulub. There's fu'ad, and the plural of fu'ad is af'ida, and there's lub. although in the Quran it always occurs in the plural as albab. There's lots of words in Arabic, but none of them mean brain. And none of them really means mind in the way that people use it in the modern world. So that's a very important point.
And the whole
Yes.
Islamic cosmology of the self is very different.
The cosmology of the self is very different.
Different than the modern notion of what is the cosmology of the self.
Hmm.
And then regarding the point you made about the
Yes.
astronomy and
Astronomy.
astrology being together.
Yeah, astronomy and astrology were never distinguished until really very modern period.
There was a remark made, and he's a Islamic scholar and specializes in black magic. And he mentioned that, in kind of passing, that if you look at tablets of Babylonia, you'll find
Yeah.
figures like angelic figures
Mhm.
giving, this kind of looks like information to humans, and it's just there.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you explain that?
Who is this person?
Atabek Shukurov. He's in the UK.
Ata Beg Shukurov. That's an interesting name.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it indicates he's probably Central Asian. Was he from Kazakhstan or something? Uzbekistan. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he mentioned this in passing, but he specializes in kind of black magic.
Okay, so yeah, so what's the point here?
The mark I made is because the whole connection between material science
Mhm.
and what we consider magic
Yes.
is a very different notion in what we consider to be than what ancients consider to be. Am I correct in that kind of?
Yeah, it's interesting that Aristotle doesn't seem to talk about that, but there was a whole area in Platonism, really, and you have to understand that this whole supposed conflict between Aristotle and Plato is very much something that these moderns have put together, I think. Yeah.
Because it wasn't a conflict that he wasn't chosen as the successor of Plato.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
That's what some people say, but there's a very interesting book by a very serious scholar of ancient philosophy named Lloyd Gerson. It's a new book called Aristotle and Other Platonists. So it's a very provocative title right there. Because they claim that, well, Aristotle rejected the whole theory of forms, and they'll say that his whole metaphysics is, in fact, the whole doctrine of substance is, in a way, a kind of attack against that. And they'll talk about, they'll postulate an early Aristotle and a later Aristotle. There's a very, very famous book by this. It's a very influential book by a German guy called Jaeger. Jaeger is with a J. On Aristotle's development and so forth. But the fact is that the ancients didn't see him as creating a different school. And Platonism, they studied the works of Plato and Aristotle together, and they commented on them, and this all sort of fit together as one unified whole. And one of the famous representatives of of Platonism, and notice I don't use the term Neoplatonism. That's another invention. But typically people speak of them as Neoplatonism. What they mean by Neoplatonism is Plotinus and after. Anyhow, so there's a Platonist by the name of Iamblichus. And Iamblichus was very interested in the actual spiritual practices. And he's about the only person where we find any of this discussed. We know that these ancient philosophers had some kind of spiritual practices. And there's a French scholar who really, I think, makes this an obvious point. And he's a scholar. He was a scholar of Plotinus. His name is Pierre Hadot. So he's written on this notion of kind of meditation or contemplation or something like this in ancient philosophy. I haven't read the book, but he's a known, very, very famous title. I think much better than this guy, actually, it was probably would be this Algis Ujdvanish, who wrote this book called Philosophy as Rite of Rebirth. I mentioned it in the very, very first lecture, or second lecture. Anyway, so Iamblichus was talking about these methods of spiritual realization, and he refers to them as theurgy. And I have a whole lecture somewhere on the web about this. If you go, there's a new page which has been made where all my lectures can be found on Facebook. So you can go. It's one of the lectures given at the Warburg Institute, and then there's another one that was given at AUC where some of these things are touched upon in more detail. So they distinguish between a kind of method of invoking God, or in fact they would use the term in the plural, the gods, involving various rites, burning various incenses and so forth. And Iamblichus in this talks about the theurgy, these methods of the word in Greek literally means God working. And it's very interesting because in Arabic, people who are involved in the occult sciences in Islam, they refer to what they do as an amal. It's a working. It's an act, really. But in Greek, this word theurgy, it means like God working, And this kind of thing was also seen as a practical science. So then the sort of evil counterpart to that was called goeti or goetia, from a Greek word meaning to wail like an animal or something. So who knows what was involved, but these kind of black magic rites of evil magic, you see. So that is all there in the ancient world, and they don't really talk much about it, but it was definitely part of ancient times. It's definitely a kind of underground sub rosa phenomenon to this day all over the Muslim world. There's things out there and people are involved in it. Anyway.
You have 20 more minutes, 25 minutes left.
Right. So, anything else? What do we have to do now? That was the second thing we need to do, is now we need to look at substance. So metaphysics is really the science of substance. So Aristotle is concerned with coming up with a science or inaugurating a field of inquiry that takes as its subject matter the study of things, of existing things, in as much as they exist. So this is the study of being, and he really thinks that the true object of metaphysics is to study substances. So for Aristotle, for example, he states there's no transcendent being out there in the universe. Instead, there are simply beings. Inasmuch as the universe, the cosmos, as it presents itself to us, to our sense experience, it presents to us particular existing things. Reality is composed of stuff, of particular things. And these beings, these things, these existing things, are real substances. So if we wish to investigate and understand being in the most general sense, we must do so by investigating the reality and nature of particular existing beings or existing things. That's how metaphysics is supposed to proceed. Now that's quite a departure from what was there before. Plato was concerned with his theory of the Platonic ideas. Those were the most real of things. So the actual things as they present themselves to us in our experience are not really real. The truly real things are the forms, the ideas that they are reflections of. And this is not emphasized by Aristotle, so obviously that's a big sticking point. It supports the idea that Aristotle had his own sort of thing, but of course then it's a long argument. You have to look at that book if you're really interested about Aristotle. But in short, in these Platonic academies, in the Platonic school afterwards, Aristotle was seen as a sort of simpler thing and more closer to human experience, and easier therefore for the beginning student to understand as a kind of preliminary before they go in to understand what the Platonic forms are about. And you can take that, you can leave it, but that's one way of going about it. And there were many attempts in the ancient world to reconcile between Aristotle and Plato.
It's really interesting when it comes to like the pedagogy of things, is that at least in the class that I took, you start with Plato and then you go to Aristotle.
Uh-huh.
You're mentioning the opposite, that you start with Aristotle.
Yeah, that's what they would do. Yeah. So, in that sense, it represents a kind of break. But before Aristotle and before Plato, there was a kind of discourse on being. We looked at that in Parmenides. Parmenides is also very much like Plato. But the pre-Socratic, there are other pre-Socratic philosophers before Socrates, and they were looking for a kind of ultimate principle or origin of the cosmos, what they called an arche, A-R-C-H-E. And he tells us that corresponds to the Latin word principium or principium, which means principle. So what then really is the ultimate principle of the universe? You had many different groups. Somebody said it was fire. Someone said it was water. There were those who, like Empedocles, who offered a combined theory where he said there's more than one arche, that he wouldn't settle on one element. It was all four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. So these were the kind of discourses that were there before, and Aristotle actually talks about these in his writings, and he isn't happy with any of them. But it's, interestingly enough, not in his book, The Metaphysics, where he first really approaches the study of being, but in another book he has called The Categories. And some of you mentioned you took a traditional class in logic, I think maybe here by Sheikh Khalil in the seminary, called Isaruji. Well, Isaruji is just, an Arabized form of the Isagog. That was a text which was written by Porphyry. What is that? Porphyry was the teacher of Iamblichus. Turn this on. All right, we just take a break here.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
It's only 1:35. Anyway, they're going to pray at 2?
2, yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we can try and move along. So he presents it in this book called, The Categories. And the Categories is really concerned with predication. It's concerned with predication. Aristotle is concerned with in the way things are said about other things. Okay? And he says that if we look at predication in this way, in other words, the way words are used to talk about things, he really has in mind substances, then in doing so, a science of the things that exist, inasmuch as they exist, will emerge. So he first puts forward a fourfold classification of the way things are said, or a fourfold classification of predication. So there are two critical notions here when we talk about predication according to Aristotle. So we have things that are said of a subject. So think of predication. Some of you have done Arabic grammar. You have a mubtada and you have a khabar. Or in logic, we would say, again, you would have a subject and a predicate. In logic, they say you have a mawdu', the subject, and the mahmul, the predicate. So we've got some sort of a subject, and then we're going to say something about it. And so what we say about a particular subject can either be said of that subject, or said about the subject, said of the subject, or it can be in the subject. So there are two basic ways then in which we can predicate with respect to any given subject. So a predicate then can either exhibit or lack one or both of these forms of predication, and that gives us four possibilities. A predicate that is said of a subject but is not in a subject. This is on page 34 because I think we have to move a little bit faster if we stop to write this on the board, but it's on page 34 in the middle of the page, paragraph 2. And a predicate that is in a subject but is not said of a subject. A predicate that is both in a subject and said of a subject. And finally, a form of speech that is neither said of a subject nor in a subject. And that's that last one really that will be a primary substance. So he gives some examples here. Excuse me. So let's look at something, what it means for something to be in a subject. So it's in that thing not as a part, but at the same time it can't exist separately from what it is in. So it can't exist separately, but it is a thing that we can conceptually conceive. And so again, he gives the same example of color. So if we have the color white, so I have a white shirt on, right? This is a white shirt. So if we take that linguistically, then in order to predicate qualities like color, there must be a subject of that predication. We can't have whiteness separate from the shirt. It's in the nature of language then that in order for there to be a predication, there must be a subject. But from that logical observation, Aristotle is making a metaphysical and ontological conclusion about objects and their properties. In order for a color like whiteness or blueness or greenness to exist, it must exist in a thing. You got to have either a white shirt or some white ice cream or a green leaf, right? There must be a thing that is colored white or green or blue or what have you. If there is no thing, there can be no color at all. So things like color are not floating around, whiteness and greenness and blueness and blackness are not floating around all by themselves. We cannot point to blackness. I can point to this black chair. This is a black chair in front of me. Or I can point to the white desks that you're sitting on, right? Or this carpet is some shade of green. You see? So that's what it means for a thing to be in a subject. All right. What about when we say things of a subject? So we have these kind of attributes that are in a subject. Now I gave the example of color. Let's dwell on this a little bit more before we go to of a subject. Aristotle actually introduces 10 categories, and they're very important. So, and this doesn't come out very clearly. This is on page 35. Since we've already introduced the notion of substance, let's just say it. You have substance, and then you have things like colors, which are called accidents. Now, I know that accident has many other meanings. It's not like, God forbid, you have a car accident or you have a biking and skiing accident, something like no. So you have a substance, then you have accident, and color is like an accident. And in fact, there are 9 accidents. And so a substance in Arabic is called al-jawhar. Accident is called al-arad. Plural of jawhar is jawahir. Plural of arad is a'rab. And the 9 accidents are quantity, quality, relation, place, or a place where, a time, when something happens, being in a particular position or state of affairs, having or possessing, doing, and being affected with an A. So all of those 9 accidents can in some way or another apply to a substance, a jawhar. So if you take a jawhar, like if you take, they always give like example of a man or thing, but you could take anything. I mean, and so you can see how quantity or quality, we're using the simple example of the rubber ball, right? It has a particular, quantitate, we can speak of its quantity. We can speak of various quantities, its wavelength, its weight, its mass. We could even speak of its shape as a continuous quantity. We can speak of its quality, it's a particular color. We can speak of relation, it's sitting on a table relative to this book, for example. It's in this particular place, it's at this particular time, etc. So those are those categories, and they're very important in Aristotle. So that is what it means to be in a subject. Now, what about when we have a predication that is said of a subject, but is not in a subject? So Aristotle gives the example of predicating human being of an individual person. So we say Socrates is a man, or Socrates is a human being. So that predicate, human being or man, is not in Socrates. Rather, the predicate human being describes what kind of a thing that Socrates is. So we say Socrates is a human being, Spot is a dog, Fido is a this, a cat, I don't know, a cat's named Fido, usually it's named for a dog in American culture, but you get my point. So Aristotle says, and I quote, "If something is said of a subject, both its name and its definition are necessarily predicated of the subject." Now Bella goes on to say that this is a key point, for predicates that are in a subject never have their definition predicated of the subject. So if you look at the example of Socrates again, let's say Socrates happens to be white. The definition of white is, and he gives a very modern physics definition of white, that it's a particular wavelength of light, and that wavelength is reflected, and therefore we say that. But the definition of human being is rational animal. And so if we take and try and substitute white in the sentence Socrates is X, if we substitute that in for X, then we would get Socrates is a rational animal. But if we substitute it and say Socrates is reflected light of wavelength, whatever it is, that is not a true predication. Because Socrates is not light of a certain wavelength. He's a human being whose body reflects light of a certain wavelength, but that's it. So what Aristotle is trying to get across is that there are two fundamentally different ways of predicating when we talk about a subject. And one is that we have a predicate that is in a subject, and it cannot have its definition predicated of the subject. And then there's predicates said of a subject that necessarily has its definition predicated of the subject. So human being, and the other one was color. So a subject is not a quality, a quantity, a relation, a place, a time. You go down the whole list. A subject is what is said of that subject. So we have some predicates in a subject and some predicates said of a subject. Now there is a class of predicates which is both in a subject and said of a subject. The key to understanding this class of predicates is that the same predicate can be said of one subject and in another subject. The example that Aristotle gives is the example of knowledge. Knowledge can be in a subject. Socrates has knowledge. The soul of Socrates has knowledge. And predicating knowledge of the soul qualifies that particular soul. That predication describes the quality of that particular soul, that it possesses knowledge. Knowledge can also be of a subject. You can speak of knowledge of grammar, knowledge of rhetoric, knowledge of metaphysics, knowledge of chemistry. So the term knowledge in that case describes what kind of thing knowledge of chemistry or grammar or engineering is. So in the one case, the subject is the soul. The soul has knowledge. And in the other, the subject is knowledge of, what did we say it was, engineering or chemistry, what have you. So this class of predicates, like knowledge in this example, can be said both of and in a subject. Finally, we come to the class of things that are neither said of nor in a subject. The things that fall under this category are not predicates at all. And this final fourth class of things is the subject, the foundation, the whole basis of Aristotle's ontology, his science of being. And I quote, this is a direct quote from Aristotle: "A substance, that which is called a substance most strictly, primarily, and most of all, is that which is neither said of a subject nor in a subject, e.g., the individual man or the individual horse." End of quote. So this is the class of subjects, things that can only be used as subjects and never as predicates. I mean, you could say green is the man, but it doesn't convey any meaning. Or you could say book is the, you can't say book is the man. Man is the, of course, if you're poetic usage and so forth. So the kinds of things that can only serve as subjects are things that are individuated. That is to say, if they're individuated, they are numerically one. The individual man or the individual horse, as Aristotle put it, or the individual tree or cat or dog. or apple or orange or, onion or what have you. So these subjects are called primary substances. For without them, none of the other forms of predication are possible. Again, Aristotle says all the other things are either said of the primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. So if the primary substances did not exist, it would be impossible for any of the other things to exist. It is because the primary substances are subjects for all the other things, and all the other things are predicated of them or are in them, that they are called substances most of all. So primary substances for Aristotle are primary precisely because they are ultimate subjects of all predication. Without primary substances as subjects, there could be no predication. And from this linguistic investigation, Aristotle reaches an ontological conclusion, namely that without primary substances, attributes and secondary substances would not exist. So that is a kind of summary of how he comes to the proper subject of metaphysics, namely substances, or primary substances in particular. And that, for Aristotle, is first philosophy. Now, this is elaborated further in the book, but we are almost at the end of our time, and that is where I will conclude with Aristotle, but I would like to point out to you one or two other things until it's time to go downstairs. And that is, has Aristotle truly established a science of being here, or not?
You just said why it was necessary.
Classification.
He's come up with a classification, but when he's talking about substances, we must remember that the word substance, and he's given the Greek word here, in Greek is ousia, and ousia literally means thingness or thinghood. And so Aristotle takes as his point of departure the universe as it confronts itself, as it presents itself to us, as we confront it, as it were. And he takes the things as they are. And he's really produced a science of existing things, I would say, rather than existence itself. He wanted originally to establish a science whose proper subject matter was the study of existence as such. But then he concludes that existence as such really comes down to individually existing things, and the most important individually existing things are primary substances, or what we really would call primary things, who are things which are primarily things. That's what really ousia would mean. Yeah. So is that really al-wujud? I don't think so.
Can we also conclude
Yes.
that the primary thing exists because it has attributes?
The primary thing exists because it has attributes?
Yeah, can that be a conclusion of Aristotle?
I don't think so. I think he's saying that you have the primary things and that's why there are attributes.
Other way around.
I think it's the other way.
Yeah, I know, but it seems like
Okay.
what is the real thing, right? I mean, when I was reading the introduction of the book, I started with demonstration and what is real. The pre-Socratic philosophers, they were thinking about what is real, right? Something that's unchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also thinking in this way that something is, because he stopped at primary thing, because in the language they're always subject. Right?
Yeah.
So can that also mean that that the primary thing exists because it has attributes? If there's no attributes, there's no way to talk about it.
I think that's more of a Platonic view. I mean, Plato says more of because of the other concepts.
Yeah, well, for Aristotle, primary substances actually, if you look further into how he elaborates this, they actually come out to species, the individual species, and it actually comes down to living things. Living things really become the primary substances. and it's the individual species, and for him that individual species always persists, is always there, even though the particular instantiations of that species, the individual man or horse, will ultimately die, but that ultimate species is still there. That's really what he says, and that's, I think, a far kind of not really what we are looking for if we're looking for a science of existence or being itself. Now, the way he came at it is that he wants to study things only insofar as they exist. And so then he gives us a very, very nice taxonomy of things in the way that they exist, in terms of predication and so forth. But I don't really think he is there with being as such. And what he really has done is he has introduced, he is cognizant of the fact that you have something that exists, and it exists, and then you have call some individual thing, call it X, and then you have some other individual thing, Y, and X is completely different from Y and distinct from Y, and both of them exist, but they have certain qualities that distinguish them. And let's say they're both primary substances. Let's say we have an individual man and an individual horse. The individual man is obviously distinguished from the individual horse. They are two different primary substances. And yes, they both exist. The fact that they are both in front of us and we perceive them, perception, is coextensive then with the existence of X and Y, or the individual man and the individual horse. But on the level of conceptual analysis, I can conceive of the existence of this individual man separate from the man, and I can conceive of the individual existence of this individual horse separate from the horse. There was a time when this individual man and this individual horse did not exist. And so the quality of being a man, a human being, or the quality of being a horse is something else. And that really is the ousia. And that is what in scholastic philosophy, they're using the Latin term, they call quiddity. And the being of the thing is different from the quiddity. And in Arabic we speak of wujud and mahiyya. On the level of conceptual analysis, I can analyze and break up, as it were, any individually existing thing in my mind into its existence and its quiddity. In the external world, I'm only confronted by the thing. There's no samurai sword sharp enough that allows me to so finely cut an individual thing that I can separate its existence and put it in a box over here, and its quiddity and put it in another box over here. Not possible. That's on the level of conceptual analysis. And so then you have to ask yourself the question that if I can do this on the level of conceptual analysis, what is more fundamental in the external world? And that was a question, and these were subtleties which were never approached by Aristotle, but were approached by people who came after him in the Islamic tradition. Farabi, Ibn Sina, and of course, as I always say, the high watermark of Islamic philosophy is Mullah Sadra. And to get to the end of the story, Mullah Sadr concludes that what is more fundamental, what is more fundamentally real in the external world is being, or wujud, rather than quiddity. Even though we are confronted by these quiddities, so it's a kind of combination of Aristotelianism and Platonism. He says it's not really the real thing. The real thing is wujud. And wujud ultimately is a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah is pure being. But we're getting ahead of the game there. But that's why. But if you really want to appreciate that in Mullah Sadra, and there's even bits of it and elements of it in Ibn Sina, you have to understand where this came from. If you just start reading it, you might sort of get some inkling. But now, hopefully, I think you have a very, very basic foundation to understand what comes later in Islamic philosophy. And if we've succeeded in that, then I think inshallah we've achieved something good and useful in today's session.
Just a word.
Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best.
The whole Aristotle's ontology is colored by his study of biology at his youth.
You are very, very right about that. His father was a physician. It's very clear that there's some indication that people, because the position of healer or physician in the ancient world in that time was a father-son. It was a family tradition. And it's highly likely that he was trained in dissection, because they used to do this, what's called tashrih. And yes, so he is highly influenced by his biological investigations, and he was a very serious biologist. He has, in the writings of Aristotle, there's a lot of writings there on animals and life and the nature of living things. Yes?
Can we come back after the prayer for 15 minutes, if possible? Unless you are pressing some discussion.
Well, what time is it now? Are you the only one who wants to come back, or will other people want to come back?
Any questions?
I'll come back to it.
Okay, I can stay after a little bit.
10, 15 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you very much.